Senator Hanson-Young.
Thank you, Madam Acting Deputy President. I rise to speak to this motion of disallowance. This has been a matter that has been—
Excuse me, Senator Hanson-Young, you need to move the disallowance first.
So I seek leave to move the motion.
Is leave granted? Leave is granted.
Thank you, Madam Acting Deputy President. I rise to speak to this motion of disallowance into the Water for Fodder program. Now, this was a program that was thought up. It was a bit of a thought bubble of the Prime Minister. Didn't know what to do to deal with those who were complaining that his government and his coalition partners in the National Party had stuffed up the management of the Murray-Darling Basin. As the drought drew on last year and got harsher and harsher, and yet this government had done nothing to make sure that their New South Wales counterparts, their Queensland counterparts and indeed even their Victorian counterparts did what they could to ensure sustainable use of the limited amount of water in the Murray-Darling Basin. Rather than doing anything to fix the problem, they went in for what they thought was an easy answer. And what is that, Madam Acting Deputy President? That's cutting South Australia's water supply. That's cutting the allocation that flows over the South Australian border. This program was designed to reduce South Australia's water by 100 gigalitres and to say that that water would then be packaged off and sold at a cheaper rate for farmers further upstream who needed water in the midst of the drought. Now, rather than accessing water from further upstream, from those who had already been too greedy, the government decided to pick on South Australia at the bottom of the system. Now, we know that this was happening at the same time as the government in South Australia, the Liberal government in South Australia, had worked with the federal federal water minister to commission a report into cutting South Australia's water supply permanently and replacing it with water from the desal plant. What does this mean, Madam Deputy President? This means that South Australians would be saddled with some of the highest water bills in the country. This would mean South Australians would be paying more than 40 times the market value for water, 40 times, because this government and their national coalition partners in the various different state governments could not be bothered putting in place the recommendations and the reforms that have been needed for far too long to make sure that the water in the Murray-Darling Basin is managed sustainably and that there is enough there in the dry times as well as the wet. Now, we know that the Murray-Darling Basin plan is almost halfway through now, and we are still well short of the actions that were required to make sure the Murray-Darling was put on a sustainable footing. Billions and billions of dollars has been spent on this reform, and yet we are staring down the barrel of this government having to announce very soon that they're not going to be able to make the deadlines promised and set out in the Murray-Darling Basin plan. I remember back in 2010 when we were debating the draft of this plan, and it was those on the opposite side, spearheaded, of course, by the former spokesperson and person in charge of water for the coalition. That was, of course, Mr Barnaby Joyce, who never wanted any reference to climate change in the Murray-Darling Basin, would not accept that the system is over-allocated and did not accept the science. He did everything he could with his Nationals mates and his big corporate irrigator mates to destroy that plan and to make it as difficult as possible for us to recover the water that the environment needs. Fast forward to 2020, a decade later, billions of dollars has been spent, and the reason we've got this program before us today is because they stuffed it up, because they didn't listen to the science. They spent all the money. Some of it, of course, went to some of Mr Joyce's mates. Some of it went to companies like that, established by Minister Angus Taylor. A lot of the money went to friends of the National Party, and where did all the water go? Well, the water continues to be siphoned off, stored in big private dams, harvested at the expense of neighbours and downstream communities. The only reason this Water for Fodder program is even on the table is because this government is crap at managing the Murray-Darling Basin. Incompetent, incapable. But what do you do when you've stuffed up the process, you've spent billions of dollars and you still don't have a management system of a river that is choking and thirsty and crying out for intervention? And you've got farmers, small family farmers throughout the basin. It's not their fault the government stuffed it up. It's not their fault that the government did everything they could to make sure the big corporate irrigators were okay, but everybody else was left high and dry. So what did the government do? Well, they said, oh, well, the bottom end of the river, they don't need as much. So they came to South Australia and argued that South Australia should have 100 gigalitres less, and that South Australians should be paying for it through the desal plant, 40 times the market value. The government's own report into this Water for Fodder program, finally released, despite the fact that this place in the Senate only months earlier asked for the documentation to be tabled. The government refused. Another sign that this government continues to cover up their stuff-ups time and time again. They refused to release that report. It did come out, finally, and what does it say? It says this program is a flop. It's a flop. They also released it at the same time as a feasibility study into South Australia's desal plant. Turns out that's a flop too. So no wonder we've got a disallowance before us today, because this government can't manage the Murray-Darling Basin. It's too busy filling the tanks and the dams of their big corporate mates and friends of the National Party. Meanwhile, small communities, downstream communities and small family farms are left high and dry. No wonder there are communities right throughout the Murray-Darling Basin who are turning their backs on the National Party. No wonder the National Party are scrambling around trying to work out why everybody's deserted them. It's because they have mismanaged the nation's biggest river system from year after year after year. And what do we know is coming next? There's a Water Ministers' Council meeting in December, and we're going to have New South Wales and Victoria, probably Queensland as well, all refuse again to find that remaining 450 gigalitres that is needed if we're to give this river a fighting chance of survival. And we'll hear all over again that these state governments cannot get their house in order to deliver the water. There'll be a push to blow out the time frame of the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. $13 billion down the drain. The mismanagement, the maladministration, the stuff-ups that have been overseen by this government in the Murray-Darling Basin are just, if it wasn't so sad, it would be laughable. And when the coalition came to power, the biggest mistake the Liberal Party made was by putting the Nationals in charge of the water portfolio. We could all see it coming. We all knew it was a big mistake. And yet, what did Tony Abbott do? He handed the keys to the Murray-Darling Basin and the coffers of public money to Mr Barnaby Joyce. And where are we today? We're up the creek, high and dry, because Barnaby Joyce cannot be trusted, the National Party cannot be trusted, and this government cannot be trusted with managing the nation's most important water supply, and they certainly can't be trusted to look after the environment and the environmental flows. So we will push through with this disallowance, and as a South Australian senator, it is the responsible thing to do, because it shouldn't be left up to South Australia to carry the can because of the mismanagement of the federal Liberal National Party and the corruption and the maladministration of the New South Wales, Queensland and Victorian state governments, who have done nothing to rectify this situation and to make sure that the reforms that science requires are implemented in full.